Chief Impact Officer at Amira, and I'm here today with the wonderful Cheri. She is our Director of Outreach and Mentoring at Amira.
Good morning, Amira community.
We are excited to be here today to have a conversation with you as survivors about finding our way, what life looks like after the life. So we talked a little bit about what this looks like for various survivors on various paths before we got on here to have this conversation. Kind of broke it down into 3 basic avenues that we're going to chat with you about today. And so I'm going to send it on over. Cheri, can you tell us a little bit about what those 3 avenues are before we do a deep dive in all of them?
Sure. So typically what we see with survivors is that there are levels of support that they may find on their path, on their journey. And if they have minimal support, typically the things that happen is they'll do their best to reintegrate into society. This is often complicated by any addiction issues they may have, and life becomes like a hit or miss kind of situation. We see a lot of relapse back into the life if there's no support. We see a lot of recidivism and incarceration without support. It's a dangerous and traumatic time in their life where they're doing their best to stay out of the life, and yet it's really hard for them. If they do connect with some services or someone who can help them along their way, a lot of times what we see is, again, they'll do their best to reintegrate, and sometimes they can do a pretty good job at managing their symptoms, the psychological trauma, and so they may experience some sleep disturbances, and maybe they'll get into recovery, addiction recovery during this time. If somebody's there to help them, a lot of times they can find stable housing and start connecting with resources to handle their mental health issues and employment guidance and that type of reintegration that happens. But in those first 2 types of avenues, a lot of times if survivors don't have a whole lot of support, what they'll try to do is they'll just try to basically box up their experience and put it away. Their goal is to reintegrate. A lot of them want to start families and have babies during that time. The last thing they need is for that information to come up and complicate their lives. The third avenue that I commonly see in my mentorship relationships is a survivor who finds someone that's able to help them, to guide them into maybe something like an Amira program, an aftercare program. And when they have somebody who's there to walk alongside them, perhaps mentor them, they can become inspired by whatever efforts that mentor is doing in the anti-trafficking organizations and in the movement. Sometimes they'll become inspired to become an advocate themselves or learn about mentoring, and sometimes they become inspired to work for the organization that helped them. And so we get to see a lot of our alumni starting to become employed by the organizations that actually help them. And I find those relationships the most rewarding.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the essential thing to remember is that after exiting the life or the game, or whatever it was called, everyone takes a different path, and there's no guaranteed path to freedom, right? There are common paths, like these 3 that you that you laid out for us, but there's also no guaranteed path. And so sometimes um, a survivor might end up on one avenue, like on the box it up avenue with minimal support, but then ends up back in the life, and then might try the reintegration path, or might end up having an advocate. So it's also not something where you start walking down a path, right? And then that's your guaranteed, exit out and finding your way to your new life, right?
Right. Yeah, those paths often weave in and out of each other. You know what I'm saying?
Mm-hmm.
Depending on how much support they get, depending on who crosses their path. We want to keep in mind that the average number of times that it takes for a survivor to exit the life is often 9.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Mm-hmm.
You know, they make those start and stops, and relapsing back into the life is very common. And
Mm-hmm.
a lot of times as we follow her path, we will see that she learns lessons along the way. She starts being able to avoid certain pitfalls. It's like that recovery model where we talk about walking down the street and seeing the pothole. And in the early days, we keep falling in the darn pothole, right? But
Yeah.
eventually we learn to walk around it. It's
Yeah.
very similar to exiting the life.
Yes. Yes. And in that, you mentioned the it takes an time average of 9 times to actually leave the life. There are certain barriers or obstacles or ties back to the life that each survivor is either trying to break or overcome, and they don't just disappear once she's physically away from the situation, or she might not even be physically away from it. All of those things, say we were going to be really academic about it, and you have 6 barriers to exit. She's got to jump over every single one of those, but then also make those disappear somehow. So, one of those things might be no job history, no education history. How is she going to deal with that? She might have children. She might she might have been in an exploitive situation with her family, so then there's no support system. So the finding our way part of this is really about how a survivor addresses all of the things that kept her tied down, right? When we say box it up, can you describe sort of what that means to someone who's just totally unfamiliar with exploitation or recovery?
Sure. So trafficking and exploitation is traumatic, and a lot of times the survivor will own every aspect of it. And so there's a lot of shame wrapped up in it. And so as she tries to put her past behind her, she will not want to talk about it. She'll try to avoid any kind of situations that remind her of that. And her goal is to just put it in the past and move on. But the problem is that sometimes quickly and sometimes over decades, that box starts to leak. And so things like triggers and consequences of maybe her criminal past, um, addictions that weren't dealt with will start to resurface. And so we see a lot of mental health issues showing up. We see some acting out, perhaps hypersexualization, because that sexual trauma is still there and it shows up in her current life little by little. And so all of those things eventually need to be dealt with, because if they're not, they're going to start showing up in her life. And oftentimes it's addiction, sleep disturbances, and emotional issues that cause difficulty in her current life. And this is actually the box leaking.
So often we see um, we see survivors who have exited and they just haven't identified their trauma. You know, there's no understanding of really that it was traumatic, that it was not normal, right? Because we have gaslighting going on. Um, and so the just that lack of understanding can prevent so much recovery. I think of survivors of sugaring and survivors of, you know, like personal sexual servitude who um, it may have just been more of a one-on-one exploitive situation, no criminal record, no nothing to show anything, leaves the situation and just not understanding that that is human trafficking, and that was trauma, but it's not something that we talk about in culture. So she has no framework of even understanding that there was so much pain to come back from. And so boxing it up, you know, she is more of a shot of leaving that alone than a woman with a criminal record who constantly has to face it, you know, every time she has a job application or something like that.
You're absolutely right. I see this a lot in my prison outreach. I'll meet women who are 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, who, when we start talking and defining human trafficking and what exploitation really is, what coercion is, I'll hear them say things like, wait, that happened to me, but I didn't know it was that. I didn't
Mm-hmm.
have language for that. And they'll they'll be able to identify that in their life currently, they have issues with men. Maybe they have attitudes towards men that, you know, they can't, none of them can be trusted, or, you know, men only want one thing. And this stems back to their experiences of trauma in those in their past that are leaking into their current life. And when we start being able to look at the experience objectively, and they learn the truth about how trafficking and exploitation happens, they're able to put the blame where it belongs. And they're able to start redefining their relationship with men and their perspectives and understanding of choice and things like that. It really opens up a lot of freedom for them decades after the fact.
Mm-hmm. I love what you said about choice, understanding what choice really is, because when you have something as powerful as money involved in the situation, there really isn't choice. There's a power play, particularly when, you know, when you're in a situation of being housing insecure or you have food insecurity, or, you know, we talked about, you know, children, you know, you have to buy diapers or something like that. Um, Sometimes I think it's well, not just sometimes, but really often, uh, survivors can get into this position of convincing ourselves or convincing themselves that they made a bad choice or they just made a wrong choice. But really, choice was not even on the table. When you have to choose between surviving and not surviving, your your natural human reaction is going to be to take the survival route.
Mhm.
Yeah. So that leads us to reintegration with what you were saying about understanding choice, understanding trafficking, understanding exploitation and trauma, reintegration. So let's talk about what that avenue looks like with a medium amount of support.
Okay. So I think of the women that I've met. I think about my own experience too, leaving the life, and there not being a name for human trafficking, there not being any of these anti-trafficking organizations. I had to prioritize my issues. What are the things that are causing me the most problem in my life? And I hear this a lot from the women that I mentor. They realize that addiction continues to cause problems for them. So they go to free 12-step programs, NA, AA, celebrate recovery. There's a ton of them these days. And so oftentimes we see them in and out of recovery, doing their best to put the substances down and start taking control of their lives. And that's a wonderful thing. They may be in and out of incarceration during this time because of their relapses, right? So, or somebody steps into their life and convinces them to start becoming involved in illicit drug activities. Very common during this phase, but it's the hit or miss kind of recovery that we see without support or minimal support. Sometimes they will enter a program, um, depending on how the program is run, um, their level of commitment, their level of self-efficacy. They can be successful. Oftentimes, it'll take a few programs for them to actually grab a hold of recovery and see it through.
And it's in this phase, there can sometimes be a lack of understanding around what true recovery from addiction looks like, because uh, with the way that the brain works in addictive diseases, addiction, when trying to drop an addiction from a substance, sometimes that addiction can transfer into something that might seem fine or normal because it's not a substance, but it's still an addictive behavior. So addiction to, we see a lot of shopping addictions, or eating disorders might come onto play, which also is not healthy. Eating disorders are actually, very addictive in nature. Or you might have an addiction to some type of particular activity like video games, something that is also desensitizing, and kind of takes you out of whatever situation you're in. And so in that reintegration phase, there might not be as deep of an understanding about how to recover from addiction without it switching into just a different addiction.
You're absolutely right. This is, the irony of this is that a lot of recovery models use the harm reduction model, right? We're looking to reduce the level of harm that exists in your life. Well, any rational human being will do the same exact thing. And so we see her switching substances to a different substance that's more legal, more acceptable, not as harmful, easier to get, cheaper, right? And so we see those addictions switching, but minimizing at the same time.
Mm-hmm. Yes, yes.
With the more
So,
support she has, the better she'll do.
so let's talk about that now. Let's talk about that third avenue of maximum support.
Right.
And I would say that from my perspective, and let me know what you think from yours. I would say that as we go through these three avenues, the first avenue really is the most common. Second avenue is less common, and this third avenue that we're not going to talk about is the least common. And we'll get to talking about why, I think. But um, would you kind of agree with that?
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's talk about the third avenue, maximum support, or advocacy, having an advocate.
Sure. So if and when she meets somebody, we like to call that person the one. And this is a pivotal relationship that crosses her path. And typically what happens in a pivotal relationship is this person, the one, is really good at establishing trust and establishing rapport. And so this person becomes that one that walks alongside her. And oftentimes we see that in mentorship. Sometimes it's established within the church environment where she'll click with somebody, and that person can start speaking into her life, or connecting her to resources, or walking alongside her as a guide to connecting with a recovery network of some sort. And it takes a lot of time, effort, commitment, and love and patience, because Trust is a really difficult thing to establish with somebody who has been betrayed and abused as much as we commonly are in the life. And so this person becomes the voice and the most trusted person for her to seek recovery.
Hmm. And that is such a special relationship too, that it can be very powerful.
Yeah, I remember when I met my mentor, it was it felt like an act of providence. It I would have never expected to meet this woman in the location where I met her. And I think I hear a lot of survivors talk about this. It was like it had to be, this person had to be sent to me because there was no way that we should have connected. And yet when we did, we had so much in common. And so it's always a very special experience to find that one. And I commonly see those relationships last a long time.
Which for this, for this avenue of recovery, that also makes a lot of sense, because recovery takes a really long time. I mean, I know that we talk about our program at Amira and the average is 2 years and it's wonderful. But I mean, recovery, those 2 years, those first 2 years at Amira, that's just the beginning. Um, and for women who don't have a program like Amira, or even a short-term program or something like that, who are just doing it on their own, who find that advocate person, their recovery path, it's a long time. It can be like a decade or two
Or longer.
or longer.
It's
Yes.
for some reason the number 37 pops up so much in my outreach experiences, my mentor experiences. I hear women talking about it was 37 years before I was able to identify that that had actually happened to me, before I heard the name human trafficking, before I met somebody who knew it. For some reason, 3.5 decades, very common for those experiences to stay in the box.
So often experiences of exploitation and trafficking happen isolated.
Mhm.
There's, it's not like every trafficking survivor, every sex trafficking victim in Boston, it's not like they all know each other. It's so siloed, to the point where I know survivors who never met anyone else in the life while they were in it, never met anyone else until they exited and then understood what really happened. So this maximum support route it's really creating community. It's establishing community in whatever way that looks like for her, whether that's at a program like Amira or in a safe and supportive environment wherever she is. um, Creating community is essential, I think, in not going back.
Absolutely. When I finally discovered that there was this amazing sisterhood of survivors that existed in not only my state, but my region and all across the country, my life just blossomed. I had people all over the country that I could contact and talk about anything I needed to talk about, learn from, be inspired by, and share my expertise with them. And so that really is a big step for a survivor to realize that there is support outside of advocates, but within the survivor community.
Yeah.
So to summarize, I guess it's safe to say that um, the different avenues that survivors can take once they exit the life can vary, and they can weave in and out of different levels depending on how much support they have. And so the most important thing is get her connected to resources. And if you don't know what those resources are in your community, in your area or her area, find an organization that is involved in anti-human trafficking and ask them for resources. But typically, your police departments and domestic violence shelters have a lot of information for resources. Police departments typically have human trafficking task forces, and so they have a lot of information.
Yes. So thank you so much for watching this conversation, being part of this conversation with us today. Thank you for being part of Hope Day 2020. Go check out our other videos from the day. We have 5 other stories to take you on this journey from exploitation to liberation with us. Thank you so much for being part of our community.